The air at the Henderson farm auction hung thick and heavy, a mix of diesel exhaust, cheap cigar smoke, and the bittersweet smell of turned earth one last time. It was the spring of 1969, and another old family farm was going under the hammer, its pieces scattered to the four winds like chaff. Jedediah Stone stood near the back, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn denim jacket, his knuckles calloused and scarred from a lifetime of wrestling with iron and soil. He wasn't here to buy, not really. He was here to watch, to bear witness. A farmer's auction was like a funeral, and you paid your respects. The auctioneer's rhythmic chant, a hypnotic cadence of numbers and promises, washed over the crowd. Jed's eyes, however, were fixed on one machine, a brand new, gleaming John Deere 4020, sitting proud and arrogant on the lawn. It hadn't belonged to the Hendersons. The dealer had brought it out special for the sale, knowing full well that with land-changing hands, a man would need a new tractor. It was a monument of modern farming, all sharp angles and green paint so deep you could drown in it. The wide front axle, the enclosed operator's station with its cushioned seat, the sheer size of the rear tires. It was a world away from Jed's own machine. His tractor, a 1951 Farmall M, was parked back at his place, probably still warm from dragging the disc that morning. Its red paint was faded to a dull orange, streaked with grease and patched with rust. The narrow front end, the simple steel pan seat, the magneto that needed a gentle touch on damp mornings. It was a relic. But it was his. Every nut, every bolt, every drop of oil in it was paid for. That meant something to Jed. It meant everything. The bidding on the 4020 started, and the crowd surged forward. Jed watched as Richard Miller, his neighbor to the west, pushed his way to the front. Rich was 10 years younger than Jed, with a soft face that hadn't seen enough sun and hands that looked like they'd never been properly introduced to a wrench. He'd inherited his father's 200 acres a few years back, and had been borrowing and expanding ever since, a golden boy in the eyes of the bank. 21,000. I got 21. Now 2. Will you give me 2? The auctioneer rattled, his voice a gravelly roar. Rich's hand shot up, clean and confident. 2! The price climbed, a dizzying ascent into numbers that made Jed's stomach clench. That was more than his entire farm was worth, the 160 acres his grandfather had broken with a team of mules. He could feel the shift in the air, the collective intake of breath from the older farmers standing around him. They, like Jed, understood what that number represented. It wasn't just a tractor. It was a mountain of debt, a promise made to a man in a suit, a gamble against the rain, the sun, and the whims of the market in Chicago. The hammer finally fell. Sold for $24,500 to Mr. Richard Miller, a fine machine for a fine young farmer. A polite ripple of applause went through the crowd. Rich beamed, shaking hands with the dealer and the banker, who materialized at his elbow as if summoned from smoke. As the crowd began to disperse, Rich spotted Jed lingering by an old hay rake. He swaggered over, his new boots crunching on the gravel, a self-satisfied smirk plastered on his face. "Well, Jed," he said, his voice a little too loud. "Quite a machine, eh? Bet that could plow your whole place in an afternoon." Jed just nodded, his gaze steady. "It's a lot of tractor, Rich." "It's the future," Rich declared, puffing out his chest. "You can't make a living with those old museum pieces anymore. A man's got to keep up. This 4020, she's got a 6-cylinder diesel, puts out 95 horsepower at the PTO. Your old M is what, 35? 40 on a good day?" "She gets the work done," Jed said quietly. He didn't like being drawn into this. He knew what Rich was doing. It was a display, a way of marking his territory as the new king of the hill. Rich laughed, a short, sharp bark. Getting the work done and making money are two different things. I'm buying the Henderson 80 next to you. With this rig, I'll have it turned over and planted before you even get your cultivator hooked up. You ought to think about upgrading, Jed. The bank's loaning money hand over fist. A man could get left behind, clinging to old junk. He gestured vaguely toward the direction of Jed's farm, his eyes lingering on the rusted tin roof of Jed's barn. The insult was clear. Jed felt a slow burn in his gut. He looked at Rich's smooth hands, at the crisp crease in his new jeans. He thought of the hours he'd spent in his own shop, his hands covered in 90-weight gear oil, carefully replacing a bearing in his old M's transmission, the satisfaction of hearing it run smooth and quiet again. He thought of the final payment he'd made on his land, the handshake with the old banker, the quiet pride in knowing that the dirt under his boots was his, and his alone. He looked Rich square in the eye. "My junk is paid for, Rich. Is that new John Deere?" The smirk on Rich Miller's face faltered for just a second. A flicker of something, annoyance, maybe even a sliver of doubt, crossed his features before being buried under a fresh wave of arrogance. "It's an investment," he snapped. "You have to spend money to make money. It's a lesson you old-timers never learned." He turned and walked away, back toward his monument of green paint and debt, leaving Jed standing alone in the thinning crowd. The auctioneer had moved on to selling household goods, his voice now a faint, meaningless drone. Jed looked at the sky, a vast, indifferent blue. He could feel the judgment of his neighbors, could hear the whispers that were sure to follow. Poor old Jed Stone, too stubborn to change. He'll be the next one to sell out. He knew the logic of their world. He knew what the university extension agents and the bankers were saying. Get big or get out. Leverage your assets. Modernize. But there was another kind of logic, an older one, that ran in his blood. It was the logic of his father, who had survived the 30s by patching his own tires and eating what he grew. It was the logic of the earth itself. You don't take more than you can give back. You don't build your house on sand, or in this case, on a mountain of bank notes. He was making his own gamble, a bet that slow and steady would finish the race when the sprinters had all collapsed. It was a lonely bet to make. Now, before we go any further in this story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever known a man like Jed? A man who stuck to his principles, who did things the old way, not because he was ignorant, but because he believed it was the right way. A man who the whole world called a fool, but who had a deeper kind of wisdom. Let me know down in the comments, because I think we all know that men like him are a dying breed, and their stories need to be told. The weeks that followed the auction settled into the familiar rhythm of spring planting. From his fields, Jed could hear the deep, throaty roar of Rich Miller's 4020. It was a constant, powerful hum on the horizon, a sound that carried across the section lines and seemed to mock the pop, pop, pop of his own farmel's gasoline engine. Rich was doing exactly what he'd promised. He plowed, dissed, and planted the newly acquired Henderson 80 in 3 days flat. Jed watched him from his fence row, seeing the big diesel tractor pull a 6-row planter, eating up the ground with an insatiable appetite. Jed, with his 4-row John Deere 494 planter, felt like a turtle racing a hare. It took him the better part of a week just to get his own corn in the ground. The talk at the co-op was all about Rich. "Did you see the rig Millers running?" one farmer would say, leaning against a stack of seed bags. "Heard he's putting in another 1,000 acres of beans over on the old Peterson place." The admiration was thick in their voices. Rich was the future. He was progress. Jed would just nod, pay for his fuel in cash, and leave. The conversations always seemed to die down when he approached, replaced by a polite but distant silence. He was becoming an artifact, a living piece of history that people observed with a kind of sad curiosity. One Saturday in May, the Farmel M refused to start. It wasn't a stubborn, damp morning refusal. It was a dead, metallic silence when he pulled the starter rod. Jed wasn't a man given to panic. He methodically went through the checklist that lived in his head. He pulled a spark plug wire, held it against the block, and cranked the engine. No spark. That narrowed it down. Ignition. He got out his toolbox, the old steel one his father had owned, the inside a chaotic but familiar landscape of greasy sockets and worn-out screwdrivers. He pulled the cap off the magneto. The points were pitted and closed. The little tungsten contacts burned and blackened. He'd been meaning to change them. He filed them down as a temporary fix last fall, and temporary had a way of becoming permanent on a farm. He drove his old Ford pickup into town, the one with the mismatched fender and the engine that burned a quart of oil every 200 miles. At the Napa store, old Charlie behind the counter knew what he needed before he even spoke. "Points for the M-Jed?" Charlie asked, already pulling a small box from a dusty shelf. "And a condenser, Charlie. Might as well do it right." Back in his shop, Jed worked with a patient, practiced efficiency. The shop itself was a testament to his philosophy. It wasn't fancy. It was a converted corn crib with a concrete floor he'd poured himself, lit by a few bare bulbs hanging from the rafters. But it had everything he needed. A heavy-duty vise bolted to a thick wooden bench, a drill press, a welder, and walls lined with coffee cans full of bolts, nuts, and washers, all sorted by size. He carefully removed the old points and condenser from the magneto, his grease-stained fingers moving with a surgeon's delicacy. He wiped the breaker plate clean with a rag soaked in gasoline, then used a fine grit file to lightly polish the new points, just to make sure they were perfectly clean for a good connection. He set the gap with a feeler gauge, turning the engine over by hand until the rubbing block was on the highest point of the cam lobe. He knew the spec by heart. 15,000ths of an inch. He checked it 3 times. A man who did a job right didn't have to do it twice. He put the cap back on, reconnected the plug wires in the right firing order, 1, 3, 4, 2, and climbed back onto the steel seat. He pulled the choke, turned the gas on at the sediment bowl, and pulled the starter rod. The engine spun twice, then coughed to life with a familiar, satisfying bark. He let it idle for a minute, listening. The rhythm was steady, the popping from the exhaust pipe clean and even. It was a good sound, the sound of self-reliance. But the breakdown had cost him half a day. The sky to the west was turning the color of a bruise, and the air had grown heavy with the promise of rain. He still had 40 acres of beans to get in the ground. As he drove the M back out to the field, he saw Rich Miller on his side of the fence. Rich wasn't working. He was just sitting on the hood of his pickup, a bottle of pop in his hand, watching. As Jed passed, Rich lifted the bottle in a mock toast. He didn't have to say a word. The message was clear. "Still playing with your toys, old man?" Jed ignored him, lowered the planter, and focused on keeping his rows straight, the sound of his own engine the only thing he allowed himself to hear. The rain came that night, a hard, driving gully washer that turned his unplanted 40 acres into a sea of mud. It would be a week before he could get back on it, a week of lost growing time. The delay meant his beans would be shorter, the pods fewer. It was a small loss, but the small losses added up. At the supper table, his wife Martha tried to be cheerful, but he could see the worry in her eyes. She heard the talk in town, too. She saw the new cars and kitchen remodels her friends were getting. She never complained. but Jed knew the weight she carried for his convictions. That year, 1970, the crops were good, but not great. Jed's late beans yielded 10 bushels less per acre than Miller's. At the elevator, the manager, a young man with a business degree, looked at Jed's scale ticket with a touch of pity. "Tough break on those beans, Jed. That old equipment, it'll cost you in the long run." Jed just nodded and took his check. It was enough to pay his property taxes and buy seed for next year, with a little left over to put away. It was enough. For him, enough was a victory. For everyone else, it was a confirmation of his failure. The decade began to turn. The early 70s arrived, and with them came a change that no one, not even the smartest men in suits, had fully predicted. The world suddenly seemed hungry, desperate for American grain. In 1972, the news came over the radio, crackling with static. The United States had agreed to a massive grain deal with the Soviet Union. The Russians were buying millions of tons of wheat, corn, and soybeans. Almost overnight, the markets went crazy. The price of corn, which had hovered around $1.25 a bushel for years, shot up to $2, then $2.50, then $3. Soybeans doubled. It was like a gold rush. But the gold was growing right there in the black Iowa soil. The government, led by Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, had a new mantra for the American farmer: plant fence-a-row to fence-a-row. The message was clear: produce as much as you possibly can. The world wants it, and we'll pay you for it. For men like Rich Miller, it was the vindication of every risk he'd ever taken. The timing was perfect. He had the land, he had the big new equipment to work it, and now he had the prices to justify it all. The roar of his John Deere Horse in 20 was soon joined by an even bigger, more powerful machine. A brand new International Harvester, 1466, its dual rear wheels tearing into the earth, pulling a monstrous 7-bottom plow. The 1466 was a beast, its turbocharged diesel engine screaming with a high-pitched whine that was the new sound of prosperity. Rich bought another 200 acres, then another 160. He tore out the old fences and hedgerows that had stood for 100 years, creating vast, unbroken fields that his big machines could work with maximum efficiency. He built 2 giant blue harvestor silos that towered over the landscape, symbols of his success visible for miles around. He traded in his pickup for a new one every year. He and his wife took a vacation to Hawaii. His name was in the county paper, hailed as a progressive, forward-thinking agriculturalist. Jed Stone watched it all happen from his 160 acres. The boom was good to him, too. That year, he sold his corn for $3 a bushel, a price he'd never dreamed of. The check he got from the elevator was the biggest he'd ever held in his hands. Martha was ecstatic. "Jed, we can finally get a new refrigerator," she said, her eyes shining. Maybe even that new color television we saw at Sears. They did get a new refrigerator, but Jed didn't buy a new tractor. He didn't buy more land. He didn't call the bank. Instead, he took that check and drove into town to the First National Bank. He walked past the loan officers' desks, where men like Rich Miller were signing papers for $500,000, and went to the teller window. He paid off the last $5,000 on his farm's mortgage. The banker, Mr. Abernathy, a man who had known Jed's father, called him into his office. "Jed," he said, leaning back in his big leather chair, "congratulations on being debt-free. Your father would be proud. But you're missing the opportunity of a lifetime." He gestured to a chart on his wall. "Look at this. Land values have doubled in 2 years. They're going to double again. With the price of corn where it is, you can't lose. Let me lend you the money to buy that quarter section north of you. We can finance a new tractor, a bigger combine. You're sitting on a gold mine, son, but you're trying to dig it out with a teaspoon." Jed listened politely. He respected Abernathy, but they saw the world through different eyes. "Mr. Abernathy," Jed said, his voice calm and steady, "I appreciate the offer, but I sleep pretty good at night, knowing that the rain that falls on my land is falling on my land, not the bank's." Abernathy sighed and shook his head, a look of genuine disappointment on his face. "You're a good man, Jed, but you're going to get left behind." Jed did make one upgrade. He sold his old Alice Chalmers pull-type combine and bought a used but well-maintained John Deere 45. It was a self-propelled model from the late 50s, small by the new standards, with only a 2-row corn head. But to Jed, it felt like a spaceship. He could now harvest his own crops without having to wait and pay for a custom harvester. He paid for it in cash. The rest of the money he put in a savings account, earning a modest 5% interest. His neighbors thought he was crazy. They saw him chugging along on his little combine, while their own massive new Gleaners and John Deeres devoured 8 rows at a time. They saw him still driving his rusty Farmall M. The scorn he'd faced before now morphed into a kind of pity. He was the old man who was too scared, too set in his ways to grab the brass ring when it came around. He was a relic, a stubborn fool who didn't understand that the rules had changed. One evening in the fall of 1974, Jed stood on his back porch, the cool autumn air sharp in his lungs. The harvest was done. His corn was safe in the crib, his beans in the bin. His farm was quiet, dark, and still. Across the road, Rich Miller's farm was a blaze of light. Huge mercury vapor lamps on tall poles illuminated his massive grain setup. The high-pitched scream of a grain auger, powered by a tractor, running at full throttle, cut through the night. Miller was still harvesting, running 2 giant combines with lights on, pushing to get every last kernel out of his 1,000-plus acres. Jed looked at the glow on the horizon, a man-made sunrise in the middle of the night. He heard the distant, frantic hum of machines being pushed to their limits. A chill ran down his spine, and it wasn't from the autumn air. He'd heard a story on the radio that afternoon, tucked between the farm report and the national news. Something about an oil embargo by countries he'd barely heard of. Something about gas lines in the cities and rising inflation. The announcer had mentioned that the Federal Reserve was thinking about raising interest rates to cool things down. Jed didn't have a degree in economics, but he had the wisdom of the soil. He knew that what goes up must come down. He knew that trees don't grow to the sky, and he knew the sound of desperation when he heard it, even from a mile away. The frantic scream of Miller's machines wasn't the sound of prosperity. It was the sound of a man running as fast as he could to stay ahead of the interest payments on a debt so large it could blot out the stars. And Jed had a terrible, sinking feeling that a storm was coming. A different kind of storm that no one could see on the radar, but one that had the power to wash everything away. The first sign of trouble wasn't a clap of thunder or a notice from the bank. It was the price of a barrel of oil. The year was 1975, and the news from the Middle East, once a distant murmur, became a shout that echoed all the way to the cornfields of Iowa. The price of diesel fuel, the lifeblood of modern agriculture, doubled, then nearly tripled. Jed saw it at the co-op pump. The numbers on the spinning dial moved twice as fast as the gallons. His 20-gallon tank on the Farmall M, which used to cost a few dollars to fill, now took a significant bite out of a $10 bill. It hurt, but it was manageable. The M was a frugal machine, sipping gasoline that he could buy in town for a little less than the diesel everyone else now depended on. For Rich Miller, the fuel crisis was a catastrophe. His two big tractors, the John Deere 4020 and the massive International 1466, were thirsty beasts. Together, they could burn through 100 gallons of high-priced diesel in a long day's work. His fuel bill became a monstrous, ever-expanding line item on his balance sheet, eating away at the profits promised by high grain prices. The numbers, which had once worked so beautifully in his favor, were beginning to turn against him. The second sign was a sound, or rather, the lack of one. It was a wet day in the spring of 1977, the kind of day perfect for working in the shop. Jed was grinding the valves on the M cylinder head, a slow, meticulous job that filled the air with the smell of grinding compound and hot metal. He was so absorbed in his work that it took him a moment to realize the familiar, high-pitched whine of Miller's 1466 had fallen silent. It had been running non-stop for 3 days, pulling a 24-foot field cultivator, trying to get the ground ready for planting. Jed wiped his hands on a rag and walked to the door of his shop. He could see the big red tractor sitting motionless in the middle of the field, a silent, crippled giant. A few hours later, the dealer's service truck rumbled down the road. A young mechanic in clean coveralls spent the rest of the afternoon lying on his back in the mud under the tractor. Jed saw him shake his head several times. The next day, a lowboy trailer arrived and hauled the 1466 away. The talk at the co-op was that the torque amplifier transmission had gone out. It was a complex, hydraulically actuated planetary gear set, a marvel of engineering when it worked, and a nightmare when it didn't. The parts had to be ordered from a regional depot, and with a backlog of other broken-down machines, the dealer said it would be 2, maybe 3 weeks before they could get it back to him. 3 weeks in May was an eternity. Rich Miller was frantic. He tried to work his entire acreage with just the 40-20, running it day and night. But he was falling desperately behind. The perfect window for planting corn was closing fast. Every day of delay was a bushel per acre lost at harvest time. Jed, meanwhile, finished his valve job, put the head back on the M with a new gasket, torqued the bolts down in the proper sequence, and had his little tractor popping away in his own fields the next morning. He finished his planting on time, his rows neat and straight, his seed tucked into the warm, moist earth at just the right moment. He felt a quiet satisfaction, not in Miller's misfortune, but in his own preparedness. He had traded speed for reliability, and for the first time, his choice was paying dividends that his neighbors could see. The cracks in Rich Miller's empire began to show. The easy smile was gone, replaced by a permanent, worried frown. His face grew pale and doughy. He'd put up a third harvest-ore silo, borrowing another $80,000 to do it. But now the price of corn was softening. The explosive growth of the early 70s had leveled off, and the markets were becoming volatile, unpredictable. The banker, Mr. Abernathy, no longer greeted Rich with a hearty slap on the back. Their meetings were held behind closed doors, and Rich would emerge looking grimmer than before. The variable interest rates on his massive loans, which had been a boon when rates were low, were now a ticking time bomb. The Federal Reserve, trying to fight rampant inflation across the country, had begun nudging the rates upward. Each quarter-point increase added thousands of dollars to Miller's annual payments. He was running faster and faster on a treadmill that was picking up speed. He bought another 80 acres, not out of ambition, but out of desperation, hoping that more volume could make up for the shrinking margins. It was like a drowning man grabbing for an anchor. Jed watched it all with a heavy heart. He saw the lights on at the Miller farmhouse late into the night. He saw Rich and his wife arguing in the driveway. The swagger was gone, replaced by the hunched shoulders of a man carrying a weight too heavy to bear. The powerful roar of his machines no longer sounded like progress. It sounded like a desperate cry against a gathering storm. The storm broke in the winter of 1979. It didn't come with wind or snow, but through the crackle of a radio broadcast. In response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, President Jimmy Carter announced a grain embargo. The primary destination for America's surplus grain was suddenly cut off. The market, which had been softening for years, didn't just fall. It plunged off a cliff. Corn that had been worth over $3 a bushel just a few years prior was now struggling to fetch $2. Overnight, the math that governed the lives of every farmer in the heartland became impossibly, brutally simple. Their product was worth a third less, but their debts remained the same. It was a body blow. But the knockout punch was yet to come. In Washington, a man named Paul Volcker took the helm of the Federal Reserve with a single-minded mission: to break the back of inflation, no matter the cost. He raised the prime interest rate again and again and again. It climbed to 12%, then 15%, then an unthinkable 20%. For farmers like Rich Miller, who held millions of dollars in variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. The interest on his debt compounded at a terrifying rate, growing faster than any crop ever could. His payments ballooned, becoming more than the entire gross income from his farm. The great, gleaming machine of American agriculture, built on the promise of ever-expanding credit and ever-rising prices, ground to a halt and began to rust. The farm crisis of the 1980s had begun. It rolled across the Midwest like a silent, invisible plague, hollowing out families and shuttering homesteads that had stood for a century. The newspapers were filled with stories of foreclosure auctions, of families losing land that had been in their name since the Civil War. The word bankruptcy, once whispered in shame, was now a common headline. Rich Miller fought it as long as he could. He sold off his new pickup. He let his hired man go. He tried to sell the 1466, but the market was flooded with used equipment. A tractor he'd paid $60,000 for a few years earlier couldn't fetch $20,000. He tried to sell some of his land, but land values were in freefall. An acre that had been worth $2,000 in 1978 was now worth $800,000. And there were no buyers. The bank, which had once been his greatest champion, became his implacable foe. The friendly loan officers were replaced by grim-faced men from the workout department. The letters that arrived in his mailbox were no longer solicitations for new loans, but registered notices of default. Jed watched the tragedy unfold from across the road. His own farm was an island of calm in the raging sea. He had no debt. The low price of corn hurt him badly. He wasn't making money, but he wasn't losing the farm either. His property taxes were paid. His machinery was his own. The money he had put into a simple savings account years ago, the money everyone had called dead capital, was now earning an astonishing 15% interest, a small but steady income stream that helped him buy groceries and fuel. He and Martha lived as they always had, simply. They ate from their large garden, canned their own vegetables, and patched their own clothes. Their life, once seen as antiquated and poor, was now revealed to be what it had always been: secure. Their stubborn refusal to take on debt had been their salvation. Jed's old Farm All M, sitting in the shed, its faded red paint a symbol of his obstinance, had outlasted the giants. It wasn't fast or powerful, but it was his. And in the wreckage of the 1980s farm crisis, ownership was the only thing that mattered. The day of the Miller Farm auction dawned cold and grey, the sky the colour of lead. It was November of 1982. The corn was out of the fields, and the land lay bare and vulnerable under the cheerless sky. Jedediah Stone drove his old Ford pickup down the lane and parked along the road, just as he had done at the Henderson auction 13 years before. The scene was sickeningly familiar, yet horribly different. The crowd at the Henderson sale had been optimistic, buzzing with the energy of a rising market. This crowd was a gathering of ghosts. The faces were gaunt, the eyes haunted. These were not neighbors looking for a bargain. They were men watching their own potential future, their own fears laid bare for all to see. The auctioneer's chant began, but it lacked the confident rhythm of years past. It was a somber, rushed affair, the sound of a funeral director trying to get through a difficult service. The big machines were lined up in a row, monuments to a fallen empire. The International 1466, its transmission now repaired, sold for a quarter of its original price to a salvage dealer from 3 states away. The Blue Harvest ore silos, symbols of Miller's ambition, were declared fixtures of the real estate and would go with the land, their value erased. Then they came to the John Deere 4020, the tractor that had started it all. It sat there, its green paint faded and scratched, a film of dirt and failure dulling its once proud sheen. Jed remembered the day Rich Miller had bought it, the arrogant smirk on his face, the confident way he'd declared it, the future. "All right, folks, what'll you give for this 4020 diesel?" the auctioneer called out. "A good solid tractor, who'll start it at 10,000. Silence. The crowd just stared. $10,000 was a fortune no one had. 9? Will you give me 9? More silence. Jed could hear the wind whistling through the bare branches of the maple trees. "All right, what am I bid? Somebody give me an offer." A man in greasy overalls finally spoke up. 3,000. A gasp went through the crowd. It was an insultingly low number. The banker, standing near the auction truck with his arms crossed, winced as if he'd been struck. The auctioneer tried to work the price up, but the bidding stalled and died at $4,500. The hammer fell with a dead, final thud. The future had been sold for scrap value. Jed didn't stay for the sale of the land. He couldn't bear to watch it. He knew the bank would end up buying it back for a fraction of what they had loaned on it. Another piece of ground turned into a sterile asset on a ledger in a faraway city. He found Rich Miller standing alone behind the barn, staring out at the empty fields. He was a shell of the man he had once been. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes were red-rimmed and vacant. He looked 10 years older. Jed walked up and stood beside him. For a long time, neither man spoke. There was nothing to say. The howl of the wind and the drone of the auctioneer said it all. "I'm sorry, Rich," Jed said finally, his voice quiet. Rich flinched, then seemed to shrink into himself. He didn't look at Jed. "You were right," he mumbled, his voice thick with shame. "All this time, you were right. I was a fool." "No," Jed said, shaking his head. "You weren't a fool. You just believed the song they were singing. A lot of good men did." He reached into the pocket of his denim jacket and pulled out his worn leather wallet. He took out all the cash he had, $240. He folded the bills and held them out to Rich. "What's this?" Rich asked, his voice cracking. "For your tools," Jed said. "I saw them on the hay rack. I know you'll need them to get started again somewhere else. I'll pick them up later." Rich stared at the money, then at Jed's calloused hand. He knew his entire collection of wrenches, sockets, and power tools wasn't worth half that at auction prices. It wasn't a transaction. It was a gift. It was an act of grace from the man he had mocked and belittled for more than a decade. A tear finally broke free from Rich's eye and traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He took the money, his hand trembling. "Jed, thank you." Jed just nodded, gave Rich's shoulder a firm squeeze, and walked away. It wasn't about being right. It was about being a neighbor. In the years that followed, the story of Jed Stone and Rich Miller became a quiet legend in the county. Jed never spoke of it, but others did. They talked about how the stubborn old man with the rusty tractor had weathered the storm that had broken so many others. They no longer saw his frugality as a weakness, but as a profound strength. His wisdom, once dismissed as outdated, was now sought after. Young farmers, starting out in the wreckage of the crisis, would stop by his shop. He never lectured them. He just showed them. He'd show them how to rebuild a carburetor instead of buying a new one, how to weld a cracked frame, how to listen to an engine and know what it needed. He taught them that the most important tool on a farm wasn't a 100-horsepower tractor, but a mind that knew how to make do, and a spirit that refused to be a slave to debt. Jed eventually used his savings to buy the 80 acres that had once belonged to the Hendersons, the very land Rich Miller had first bought in his quest for expansion. Jed bought it from the bank for cash, paying the same price per acre his own father had paid for his land back in the 40s. He didn't do it to get bigger. He did it because it was good land, and it hurt him to see it sit empty and untended. Life settled into a new, quieter rhythm. The 1980s gave way to the 90s. Jed grew older, his hair turning the color of winter wheat, his movements slower but still deliberate. His grandson, a boy named Daniel, started spending his summers on the farm. He was a child of a different era, fascinated by computers and video games. But he was also fascinated by his grandfather. One warm afternoon in late summer, Daniel, now 14, found Jed in the shop. The old Farmall M was parked inside, its hood open. "What are you doing, Grandpa?" Daniel asked. "Setting the points on the magneto," Jed said, not looking up from his work. He held up a small, thin strip of metal. "This is a feeler gauge. You have to get the gap just right. 15 thousandths of an inch. Not too wide, not too narrow. Too wide, and the spark is weak. Too narrow, and the points will burn up. It has to be just right." He showed Daniel how to turn the engine over by hand with the crank, watching the cam lobe inside the magneto. He let the boy hold the gauge and feel the slight drag as it passed through the gap. "Why don't you just get a new tractor, Grandpa?" Daniel asked, his curiosity honest. "One with electronic ignition?" Jed stopped what he was doing and looked at his grandson. He wiped a spot of grease from his knuckle with a clean part of his rag. He looked past the boy, out the open door of the shop, across the fields that stretched out to the horizon, green and gold under the afternoon sun. "This tractor," he said, patting the M's faded fender, "taught me a lesson that's more important than horsepower. It taught me the difference between what something costs and what it's worth. We paid for this tractor a long time ago, but its real worth is that it never owned us. This land out here, it's not just dirt, Daniel. It's freedom. As long as you don't owe any man a dime for it, you're the richest man in the world." He finished his work, put the cap back on the magneto, and climbed onto the old steel seat. He pulled the starter rod, and the engine coughed to life with its familiar, rhythmic pop-pop-pop. It was not the roar of power or the whine of progress. It was a quieter sound. It was the sound of endurance. It was the heartbeat of a farm that had survived. Jedediah Stone looked at his grandson, a smile creasing the corners of his eyes, and knew that the most important legacy he would ever leave behind was not the land itself, but the simple, hard-won lesson of how to hold on to it.